You are gonna love this. Government's debt and deficit. Here's a review of what you've seen before. The government's budget is government's revenue minus its expenses. And it has a very simple formula. T is the tax revenue and G is the government purchases. So if government's tax revenue is greater than its purchases, it means the government is earning more than it's spending. So that's called a budget surplus. If the government's revenue is less than its expenses, that's called a budget deficit, right? So that's a negative budget balance. So the first case is when the government is saving because its revenue is more than its expenses. The second case is when the government is borrowing, all right? And that's the whole idea of deficit or surplus. When we talk about a budget deficit or a budget surplus, it is a change in government's debt. Debt itself is the accumulation of past deficits, all right? So you can think of deficit as a flow, a change in something, an ongoing process, as opposed to debt, which is a stock, which you have accumulated over time. So that's really the difference between deficit and debt. One of them is a flow, one of them is a stock. One of them is a change in what's outstanding, and one of them is the outstanding amount. There's also this concept of primary budget deficit, and primary budget deficit is G minus T. This is for any given year. It is added to the outstanding debt. So the definition of the primary budget deficit is to what extent the current tax revenues can cover the government's current spending. If the tax revenues cannot cover the current government spending, then that's going to be added to the debt. Notice here, one concept here is the current. So we are talking about each given year. That's the primary budget deficit. If you have an expansionary fiscal policy, this is again old stuff. That is either when G goes up and or the taxes go down. Now what happens, look at your formula of the government's budget balance. Is that going to create a deficit or a surplus? If G goes up, that means a bigger negative. If T goes down, that means a less positive. So that's going to create more deficit for the government. Write down. A simple rule of thumb is that what the government spends should equal what it earns. Duh. Now, if the government spends more than what it earns, it must borrow the rest. And that is called running a deficit. So when you're told that the government is running a deficit, it simply means that they're spending too much. And it is accumulating debt. That's what it means, right? So what government spends is the same as government purchases and its debt payments. So debt payments from before, the interest that it has to pay on its old debt. That should equal what it earns. And what it earns is tax revenue plus borrowing. Okay? Now you might be like, hang on, what if the government is saving? Well, saving is just a negative borrowing. So saving is also included in the borrowing part. One of them is a debit, one of them is a credit, but they are of the same nature. So government purchases is G, debt payments are I times D. I'm going to tell you what that is. That should equal T, which is tax revenue, plus the amount borrowed. D is simply government's debt from before, and I is the interest rate. So I times D is the interest payment on the government's debt, right? So this is kind of like the interest that the government has to pay every year on its outstanding debt. It's called the debt service payments. That is a useful formula, so highlight it or underline it when you write down your notes. Moving on, government's budget deficit is when the government spending is more than its earning. Okay, so that's the meaning of deficit. So that is government expenditure minus revenue, right? So that excludes the sign. So we don't put a negative here because deficit implies that it's a negative. And that is the amount which must be borrowed every year. And that is added to the government's debt. So budget deficit is the same as G plus ID, that's government's expenditure, the part in brackets, is the government expenditure, minus T is the government's revenue, and that equals delta D. Delta D is the change in debt. Okay, it's the change in government's outstanding debt. Just a point here, taxes also include transfer payments. If you remember, we have these welfare payments and subsidies where the government helps people. It's a negative tax. That is already included in the T. So T is the net, the total overall, including the positive and the negative. So everything is really included there. That is a useful formula. Now, a common question here is a high government debt a problem? A lot of times in the news you hear about, high debt as if it's a problem and we should panic. Oh no, we have a debt. Well, the answer is not necessarily. So this is the common misconception that when a government has a lot of debt, it is assumed to be a problem. What really matters is the relative size of the debt to the size of the economy, and the size of the economy is the GDP. So we must look at the debt to GDP ratio. It's always a relative measure. If the GDP is rising faster than the government's debt, then that's not a problem. But if the GDP is rising slower than the government's debt, then it might be a problem. So write down. So here's an example for the common misconception where people panic or talk about it as a weakness of a government when there is a lot of debt. So let's say our economy is growing and the government is running a deficit. Is there a problem? When you say the economy is growing, it means the GDP is rising. When we say the government is running a deficit, it means the debt is rising. So the answer is not if the GDP is rising faster than the government's debt. The problem is if the debt to GDP ratio keeps rising persistently, the ratio. So it's not really as simple as it may sound at the beginning. All governments have billions of dollars of debt. It's more complicated than the absolute size of the debt. It's about the relative size of the debt to the GDP. So Canada's debt to GDP ratio was about 70%, which was its peak in 1996, more than 20 years ago. In 2001, it fell down to 50%. The government's debt was not necessarily falling. The debt to GDP ratio was falling. And by 2008, it was about 30%. It rose a little bit after the 2008 recession, but it is still in the 20%, 30% range. Okay? All of that is because of economic growth. So economic growth means when the GDP goes up, and if the GDP goes up, it enables the government to make more revenue on taxes, so it can compensate some of its old debt. So that's not necessarily a problem. Pause here and write down your notes. If GDP goes up, our tax revenue is going to go up because the government purchases and debt are independent of GDP. So that's ceteris paribus, so there's no change in fiscal policy, but the T, we had a formula for T, if you remember, capital T equals small t times Y. Y is the GDP and T is the tax rate. So if GDP goes up, our total tax revenue is also going to go up, right? And this dot here is simply multiplication. If you don't like it, write across. Also, the government will have to pay less for transfer payments because fewer people will qualify for welfare. Just think about it. If the GDP goes up, what does it mean? It means a higher national income. So overall, people have more income. So a fewer portion of people are going to fall in the brackets that are qualified for welfare. So these transfer payments, you've seen them before. An example of a transfer payment is welfare, right? So less people qualify for welfare, which means the government has to pay less to people. That also boosts the government's revenue position. Overall, when GDP goes up, the government's deficit is going to drop. That should be fairly intuitive. During a recession, which is also called the bust, there is going to be low GDP, low aggregate expenditure, and low aggregate demand. And because of that, the government collects less taxes but pays more transfer payments. And this itself is actually helpful. During a recession, you don't really want to collect taxes from the people because a lot of them have lost their jobs. A lot of the companies are struggling. but you do want to pay them more transfer payments because you want to help them out. And you do that because of this built-in system. This is not because of a policy. The government is not changing its policy. It's just because of the tax brackets, really. So aggregate expenditure is going to increase because of the lower taxes and the higher transfer payments. Aggregate demand is going to increase. It's going to shift to the right. And if you do the graph, you're going to see the GDP is going to increase. So it's kind of like offsetting the initial recession. So initially the GDP went down because of the recession, but because of these taxes and transfers, we kind of help the economy. During an expansion, which is also called the boom, there is high GDP, high aggregate expenditure, and high aggregate demand, exactly the opposite of a bust. The government collects more taxes and pays less transfer payments, so more people are qualified to pay taxes, less people are qualified to receive transfer payments. So aggregate expenditure is going to shrink a little bit, aggregate demand is going to shrink a little bit, and GDP is going to shrink a little bit. So this is basically kind of dampening all of the fluctuations of the economy. So our tax and transfer system dampens the variations of GDP. All right, and all of this is automatic. So that's called automatic fiscal stabilizers, without any active decision or policy move by the government. Pause here and write down. Now, you might think like, okay, a deficit is not necessarily a problem. Actually, it is because of a crowding out effect. When the government is running a deficit, it means it's borrowing, it means it's accumulating debt. That is the same as negative saving. Remember, borrowing and saving are the two opposite things. Borrowing is when your spending is more than your revenue. Saving is when your spending is less than your revenue, right? So if you remember, we had this idea of national saving, which was private saving plus public saving, or the private sector saving and the government saving. Yeah, if the public saving or the government saving goes down, national saving is going to go down. And you had a graph for NS, national saving, and it's going to shift to the left. So we're going to go to our loanable funds market, or the financial capital market, with the quantity of funds on the horizontal and the interest rate on the vertical, and we are going to look at our two curves, the national savings and the investment. So investment is really demand for loans, or the idea of borrowing. Now we had our equilibrium E1 with interest rate and some investment level. So that's like the initial situation. Now all of a sudden the government starts running a deficit, which means it is borrowing, which means it is saving less. So the government saving is going to go down, and you would shift the line to the left, and you get a new equilibrium where the interest rate is higher. Okay, that should be fairly intuitive. If there is less amount of saving available, it means less loans available, less funds available for loans. So if somebody wants to borrow, it's going to be more difficult to find some funds. The interest rate is going to go up. It's going to discourage borrowing. So the investment is going to go down. So if you look at your graph, the investment is going to drop to I2. All right, so that's fairly intuitive. When there is less saving, the interest rate is going to go up, and it's going to reduce the amount of borrowing. A tip here, whenever you deal with the interest rate, immediately you must think about borrowing. Okay, interest rate is the cost of borrowing. That's going to help you understand a lot of all these analyses. Also, consumption on durable goods is going to fall because they are bought on credit, and credit means borrowing. So durable goods like non-American cars or appliances, they're usually bought on credit. So consumption is going to go down. Also, higher interest rate is going to attract capital inflows. So if you remember, we had this idea of foreigners investing in Canadian assets. If the interest rate is higher in Canada, they're going to be attracted in investing in Canada. So they're going to buy our Canadian dollar. So the Canadian dollar is going to appreciate. And when the Canadian dollar appreciates, our exports are going to fall, our imports are going to rise. For foreigners, it's going to be more difficult to buy from us, so exports are going to fall. For us, it's going to be easier to buy from them, so our imports are going to rise. Both of them are going to result in lower net exports. and that's called the crowding out of net exports. Overall, what's happening here is that public spending goes up at the expense of private spending. Public spending means G, remember the formula? Private spending means C, I, and NX. This is called the situation where public spending crowds out private spending. Okay, this is an extremely important concept. If you need to rewatch it, rewatch it. The whole idea, the central thing here is the idea of interest rates. All of the process relies on this interest rate going up. So the government initially runs a deficit. Running a deficit is really the government's way of stimulating the economy. They like to give a push to the economy. They like to increase aggregate expenditure by running a deficit. But an unwanted consequence of that is that the interest rates also go up, and that's going to crowd out other forms of spending. Pause here and write down everything. Draw the graph with the shift also. The opposite of crowding out is crowding in, and that's when the government has a surplus. So it's going to attract more private sector spending because the interest rate is going to fall. The government deficit crowds out private sector spending, including investment. And investment is kind of central here, so that's important. Because when the investment goes down, there's going to be lower long-run growth rate. If you remember, when we talked about growth, economic growth, the source of that is really technology, and technology comes from investment in capital. So when the firms invest in physical capital and human capital, that's quite a key to long-run economic growth. And growth of real GDP per capita means standard of living. So we really care about our growth because that is our standard of living. Government deficit today tends to hurt future generations because of that idea of growth. Okay, so because it's going to reduce our productive capacity. Unless the fiscal expansion is made on projects with long-term benefits. So it really depends on what kind of a project it is that the government is spending on. If the project is a short-term project, then that's not very smart. It's not very useful for the future generations. If it's something with long-term benefits, then it could be. So government projects with long-term benefits on productivity would be like a highway that substantially reduces transportation time for workers and products. Or long-term medical research. There are some forms of research that it's very hard to be done by private sector. So maybe in those cases you could have government intervention. These are examples of public goods and positive externality. The classical example, you might want to write this down. The classical example of a public good is a lighthouse. So a lighthouse, if you think of it, it's very unlikely for the private sector to make a lighthouse because you can't control who gets it. Anyone out there can see the light, right? So the idea here is that let's have the government. Or you can think of street lights, or you can think of roads. Roads are things that they're primarily built by the government because everybody benefits from them. All right, or national security. Positive externality is when you do something that benefits others without being paid for it. All right, so that's also an idea of if there's long-term medical research, there is some spillover benefits. Government projects with only short-term benefits would be something like sporting or cultural events. So, for instance, the Winter Olympics in 2010 in BC would be an example of that, right? These things are extra cost for the government, and the cost is to be paid by future generations. All right. Here's time to pause and really think about any good life that we have right now is because of some sacrifice by the previous generations. All right. Which makes us really think, what kind of spending do we like to have by the government, and what kinds of spending do we not like to have by the government? Which kind of spending is inefficient and unnecessary, and which kinds of spending are useful? In a way, we need the government to make the government less. In other words, we need a government to curtail and set the boundaries for its own activities. That's the kind of government that we want, at least from the economic point of view. Anyway, pause here and write down your notes. If you remember, we had this thing called a recessionary gap, And a recessionary gap is when the GDP is low, right? When there's low spending by everyone, right? So there's going to be lower private spending by households, firms, and the foreigners. So C, I, and X are going to be low. What should the government do to deal with this problem? Well, it's expansionary fiscal policy. An expansionary fiscal policy is when the government spends more money and or taxes less. Yeah. So we're going to look at these two options. We're going to see how are these two different, G versus T. If the government spends more, there's going to be more aggregate expenditure, and the AD is going to shift to the right, and the GDP is going to rise. Okay, so it's kind of like we're closing the gap. There was a negative output gap, we're closing the gap. GDP goes back to its potential, but its composition isn't the same as before the shock. What does that mean? It's the same size of the pie, but the shares of the pie are not the same. The share of the government sector becomes greater. That's the whole idea of the crowding out. The crowding out says that the government's share becomes bigger, bigger, and bigger, and hopefully someday it's going to explode. Oh, look at poor Mario. It's about to explode. But the private sector's share is going to reduce. So lower private investment. So lower long run growth rate. So one side, which is the government, has this big share of the pie, and everybody else, the households and the firms and the foreigners, the share of them is going to be much less. The problem with that is lower long-run growth. Now, you might be like, hang on, what if the government spends money on things like education and roads? Well, yeah, that's good. That's a good kind of spending. But even there, still, government's projects are always less efficient and less effective than the private sector. And we talked about this. The whole key here is competition. There is no competition with the government. The government has no incentive to be more efficient because it's not competing with anyone. With the private sector, the advantage is that if you're not good, if you cannot keep up with the competitors, you're out of the business. So you better keep up your quality, and you better keep your costs low, right? And you better provide something with better quality and a lower price. The other option is if the government lowers the taxes. If they lower the taxes, remember again, whenever you have taxes, you should immediately think about the disposable income. So people have more disposable income, they're going to spend more, aggregate demand goes up, it shifts to the right, and the GDP goes up. So again, we go back to the equilibrium. Lower taxes induce private sector spending. Okay, whether the taxes are on the firms or on the households, they have more money to spend. Our long-run growth rate is less affected because the government's share is not increasing in this case. It's just the private sector. The trade-off, though, is that there is less government spending on education, healthcare, and infrastructure. So in both cases, and this is kind of important, you might want to watch for this. In both cases, the government is running a deficit. The government's debt is increasing, right? So because if the government lowers the taxes, it would have to lower the G. Okay, maybe later it has to raise the taxes. So both of them have their drawbacks. Perhaps the solution is that initially you can have a government stimulus, let's say more spending by the government, only initially to close the gap, and then reducing the G and letting the private sector pick up. All right, so you don't want to permanently replace the private sector with the government sector because of those efficiency concern and the long-run growth. Here's something quite cool and also logical. It's called the Ricardian equivalence. The idea is that the government's budget deficit is the same as taxes that should be paid by future generations. In other words, the government has only one source of revenue, and that is taxation. All right, now you might be like, hang on, what about borrowing? The government can also borrow money. But think of it. What does it mean if the government borrows money? It's getting into debt, right? How is it going to pay the debt later? So borrowing today only means a postponement of taxation. Effectively, the government at the end of the day has only one source of revenue, and that's taxes, right? So the bonds, if you remember, bonds are the government's way of borrowing, right? Effectively, at the back of the bond, it says in very small letters that the government will raise taxes to cover the interests later. That's what it means. If the government issues a bond, the bond simply means that the taxes are going to rise later in the future when the bond's maturity comes about. So the government's choice effectively is either tax now or tax later. They have no other option. And since individuals are forward-looking, which means rational, they take this into account. So people know that if the government spends more money, more government spending is exactly the same as more taxing, because the government has no other source of revenue. This was proposed by a famous and influential economist called David Ricardo. He is not recent. He is a brilliant thinker, a British economist. He's also one of my heroes, other than Friedman. So, one thing that I do want to emphasize here is this idea that the government has only one source of revenue. You might want to highlight that. So, here's an example for the Ricardian equivalence. Let's say there is a tax cut. A tax cut, remember, a tax cut is a popular thing to do for the government because people don't like taxes. So a tax cut means that the T goes down and we assume that there is the same level of spending. That's ceteris paribus. Now, a tax cut, does it create a deficit or a surplus for the government? It means lost revenue for the government, right? So this is going to result in a budget deficit for the government. Wow, that's cool. Which means the government has to borrow money because it has the same level of G as before. So it has to somehow finance its spending. And this borrowing is something to be paid off by later generations, right? Through taxes. That's kind of a funny cartoon. No change in the permanent or lifetime income of the consumers. Okay, so effectively what people care about is their permanent income. Okay, which means they look forward and they take into account any future taxes that come their way. That's the idea of forward-looking expectations. And that's going to result in no change in consumer spending, even though there is a tax cut, because people take that into account, which means no change in aggregate demand, and that is an ineffectiveness of fiscal policy. Pause here and write down. An interesting question about the government debt is who should own it? Should the government's debt be owned by Canadians or by foreigners? An argument here is, if it is owned domestically, then the interest payments by the government on its debt will not leave the country, and it can stimulate our economy. So it's better to have Canadians own our debt instead of foreigners. But this is a fallacy. So suppose the government decides to turn its foreign debt into domestic debt. So the government has, remember, the government's debt is the same as bonds, and bonds is basically when the government sells this piece of paper which promises future payments, right? It's a form of saving. It's a form of investment by individuals, right? So the government has these bonds. It has to issue new bonds to Canadian households and use its proceeds to pay off its foreign debt. The question is, how would Canadian households purchase government bonds? Where are they going to bring the money from? Remember, we are talking about Canadian households as a whole compared to foreigners as a whole. So we have two big groups. So what they would have to do is they would have to turn an equal volume of privately issued debt into government debts. And privately issued debt means bonds issued by Canadian firms. They have to sell off those in order to have money to buy government's debt. That doesn't really solve the problem because the interest payments leave the country again, right? The only difference is that before we had government bonds being owned by foreigners. Now we have the government bonds owned by Canadians, but there is the private sector bonds owned by the foreigners. Now this might be a little bit abstract, so let me give you numbers. So I'll give you a simple example which is going to illustrate why this is not going to work. Let's say the government has $9 million of debt. Okay, the $9 million of government debt is divided between two groups. $6 million is owned by Canadians, $3 million is owned by foreigners. We come in with this argument and say, hey, this $3 million that's owned by the foreigners, let's convert it to Canadians. So let's also say that the private debt is $9 million. So private debt means the Canadian firms owning, having issued bonds, right? And let's say it's all sold to the Canadian household. So Canadians own $9 million of private debt, and they also own $6 million of government debt. So the government wants to convert its debt into all domestic debt. Okay, now the question is, the $3 million that the Canadians are supposed to buy, how are they going to bring the money? Where are they going to bring the money from? Yeah, if they have a fixed level of savings, what it means is that they would have to sell off some of their private debt, some of the Canadian firms' bonds, in order to have enough money to buy government's bonds. What's going to happen is that the 9 million domestic debt is going to convert into 6 million domestic debt and 3 million foreign debt. So the Canadian households have to sell off 3 million of the private debt that they own. They would have to sell it off to the foreigners in order to have enough money to buy the government's debt. Now, if you think of it, this really doesn't change anything about the overall economy, the level of spending that stays inside the country, and the level of money that leaves the country. That's the point of it. Write these down before proceeding. The first solution that we looked at was really only a change of the owner, but it doesn't change our economy as a whole. It doesn't affect our GDP. It just makes, the government debt being replaced by the private debt, or vice versa. Okay. The second solution is, if the government has to offer a higher interest rate on its bonds, then the households have an incentive to save more. So the idea is that the household can save more instead of, selling off their private debt. Is that going to be a good idea? Is it good for the government to offer more interest? It's going to worsen the government's fiscal position. The assumption is that the government is in debt. If the government is in debt, it doesn't really want to raise the interest it's paying. The government will be in more debt, and it has to cut G or raise T. This really defeats the purpose. The whole point, the whole argument was that you want to stimulate the economy. You cannot stimulate the economy by cutting G or raising T. Okay, that's a fiscal contraction. It's not going to stimulate your economy. That's going to defeat the purpose. So the idea is that let's not be too smart. You cannot change anything by changing a composition of the debt, whether it's domestic or foreign. That's not going to make a difference.